Okay, so let's just finish up part one really quick. And we'll start to go into more detail on red blood cells. And then part two, we'll kind of finish that up and we'll get through any detail you ever wanted to know about a red blood cell. What's the technical term for a red blood cell? Erythrocyte. Remember, erythro means red. So erythrocyte is literally telling you red cell. We call them red blood cells because they are red. They appear red. They make the blood appear red. The reason for that is because red blood cells, about a third of their weight is something called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin's red. So there's a bunch of red hemoglobin that makes the red blood cell look red. All the red blood cells make the blood look red. Okay? But that's what we call them, erythrocytes, means red cell. Again, remember that the formed elements are the cells that are present in our blood, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and 99.9% of those formed elements are red blood cells. So they're by far the most common cell that you're going to see in the blood. And they make up just less than half of your blood on average. About 46% or so of your blood is red blood cells. So we'll talk a little bit about hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is really the functional unit in a red blood cell. It's the hemoglobin that's doing the work and allowing that red blood cell to be functional. We already mentioned that it's what gives blood its color, its red color. It is a pigment. But more importantly than that, we'll talk about its function. So hemoglobin's a protein, right? We know proteins are chains of amino acids. We know they're pretty big. We know they typically have pretty complex shapes, right? When we look at this hemoglobin, we see that it's the actual protein that's responsible for binding and transporting the respiratory gases, which that's the whole function of a red blood cell, right? To move oxygen through the blood and to move CO2 through the blood. It's the hemoglobin that's actually binding to the oxygen and actually binding to the CO2 so that the red blood cell is able to carry it. We'll see that the oxygen and carbon dioxide actually bind at two different parts of the hemoglobin, just because obviously they're different. So they're attracted to two different areas on the hemoglobin, but it is the hemoglobin that's responsible for carrying those respiratory gases. When we look at red blood cells, their structure is very important to their function, as always, right? Anatomy always determines physiology. So there's a few important parts that we'll point out about the structure. In general, they're relatively small, disc-shaped cells. Remember in lab, or if you go to lab today, you'll see that the red blood cells are a lot smaller than the white blood cells. They're relatively small cells, and they're disc-shaped. Disc-shaped meaning they're like flat on the top and flat on the bottom. It's kind of weird, right? Like the white blood cells are spheres, like balls. So a disc shape is kind of an odd shape. But that's going to be really important for a couple different reasons. We see that they're a lot wider than they are thick, and that's going to affect their surface to volume ratio, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And then this kind of thinness in the middle is also gonna make it easy for them to bend and flex and twist if they need to. They're what we call biconcave. What does bi mean? Two. They have two concave surfaces. Remember, concave just means like it caves in. It doesn't flex out, it caves in. So when you look at this, you see it caves in right here, and it caves in right here. So it's kind of that like donut type shape, right? And that's also important because this thinness in the middle is another thing that helps it kind of bend and twist, and it can flex across its middle pretty easily because the middle is more flexible than the outside. So again, we'll see how that's important with its function. Along the lines of being flexible, we have a flexible plasma membrane. It's a lot more fluid than some other cells that we have. And we already mentioned that about a third of the cell's weight is hemoglobin. So when you actually look at like the weight of a cell, you see hemoglobin and you see water. That's pretty much all the weight in the cell. When we look at them, we'll see that there's no nucleus. When the red blood cell is going through development, like from the stem cell, and it goes through all of its like proerythroblast and erythroblast and reticulocyte as it's developing, we'll see that there's a stage where it ejects the nucleus, gets rid of it, because it doesn't need a nucleus. Most of the organelles, non-existent. No ribosomes, no mitochondria, because it doesn't need them. All this does is carry oxygen and CO2, and it does that with hemoglobin. So almost all of the actual solid stuff that's present in red blood cells is just this hemoglobin. It's really the most important thing with the red blood cell. So again, I said that this anatomy is important for its physiology, right? Or its structure is important for its function. And these are just a couple of the important things about the structure of red blood cells. One, I mentioned that it has a high surface to volume ratio. Right? That was because of that biconcave disc shape. So what that means is that there's a ton of surface area with not very much space in between. The importance of that is that no matter where you are in this red blood cell, you're always really close to the plasma membrane. So it's really easy to diffuse in and out. That's one of the reasons why the red blood cell can quickly absorb and release oxygen, which needs to happen. The blood doesn't like stop at a cell and take time for the diffusion to occur. The blood is rushing around. So the oxygen and the CO2 need to diffuse really, really quickly in and out of the red blood cells. If this was a cell that looked like that, instead, this is a lot further to diffuse out of the cell, right? So the fact that we have a huge surface area with really little space in between, or a high surface to volume ratio, means that it's pretty easy to diffuse in and out. The disc is also beneficial because the discs allow the red blood cells to form these nice little stacks that we call rouleaux. They're disc shaped, so the top and bottom is flat. Right? So think like a dinner plate, or like I said before, a donut. You can stack them nicely, one on top of each other, right? And they form these nice, even little stacks. We see that the red blood cells form these rouleaux as they go through really narrow blood vessels. And that makes sense, that decreases turbulence. If they were sphere-shaped, spheres don't stack very nicely, right? So they would kind of bounce around into each other as they try to go through these smooth vessels. But the red blood cells just stack one on top of each other, they form these nice little stacks, and then they orderly go through these really thin vessels just like this. Just again, decreases turbulence, improves flow. Finally, we mentioned that they're really flexible. And this is because of the disc shape as well as that flexible fluid plasma membrane. And that allows the red blood cells to flex and bend and fold to fit through really, really small vessels. Our capillaries are our smallest blood vessels. They're microscopic, they're smaller than most cells. Capillaries are tiny. And we actually see that a red blood cell can fit through a capillary that's about half its size. So it can bend and twist up to get half its size in order to fit through an itty bitty little vessel. And that's pretty impressive. Not a lot of cells have the ability to do that. Here we see a couple pictures of red blood cells. When we look at them with the microscope, just like a normal scanning electron microscope, this is what we see. And they look flat, right? They look like little flat circles. And that's just because we put them on a slide and we squished them so they appear flat, even though they're not. But you can kind of see how they're lighter in the middle? That's showing you that it's thinner in the middle. More light comes through. There's less that hemoglobin, it's more light comes through, so they appear lighter in the middle. That's kind of giving you that clue that it is a disc shape that's biconcave. This is the actual 3D shape. So on here, you can see that they have that depression in the center. You can see that it's flat on the top and the bottom, and then round around the outside. And they're relatively small cells, extremely numerous, and obviously they are red. This is just showing you the way that they form nice little stacks. So this is like a sectioned blood vessel, right? So like this is a blood vessel. This is a blood vessel. And these are the red blood cells. Look how nicely they line up. Right? Most cells wouldn't do that. They're being rushed around under high pressure really quickly. The shape really allows them to just like slip right into each other in order to really nice and orderly go through the small vessels without creating too much turbulence that would interfere with blood flow. So the last little thing about red blood cells. So we said that red blood cells lack a nucleus, right? They eject the nucleus, they don't have one. They don't have mitochondria. What are mitochondria important for? ATP synthesis. They don't have ribosomes. What are ribosomes important for? What? Protein synthesis, excellent. They're important for protein synthesis. So you can imagine, and actually, in the nucleus, that's where we have our DNA, which is our recipe for how to make a protein. So you can imagine that red blood cells can't make proteins, and they're not really good at making ATP, right? Because the mitochondria is where we do that efficiently, where we're able to make a lot of ATP. And this is not an accident, okay? This is entirely on purpose when we start to look at the design and the function of the red blood cell. So right off the bat, real quick, just because they don't have the recipe for proteins in the nucleus, the DNA in the nucleus, and because they don't have ribosomes, they don't make proteins. So it's really difficult for them to repair themselves, where other cells can just, make collagen and keratin and, just put new phospholipids in the membrane and repair themselves pretty easily. Red blood cells can't do that. So they have relatively short lifespans. They have about 120 days max, and that's long. But they have relatively short lifespans compared to some other cells that can last years. So they don't make proteins, right? Because they don't make proteins, they have relatively low energy demands. They don't do much, right? It takes energy to make things. It takes energy to be constantly, performing whatever your function is. All the red blood cell has to do is carry the oxygen and CO2, and it doesn't have to expend energy to do that. That's diffusion. So they have very low energy demands. That's not an accident. Because they have very low energy demands, they can rely on anaerobic respiration or anaerobic glycolysis to make ATP. What does anaerobic mean? Without oxygen. So no oxygen. It's a good thing they can rely on that much ATP because remember, they don't have mitochondria. Mitochondria is where we make ATP aerobically, right? That's where we make a lot of ATP using oxygen. They don't have mitochondria, so they don't even have that option. They can only make ATP anaerobically without oxygen. Again, this all leads up to the next point. The whole reason behind this is that, remember, what's the job of the red blood cell? To transport oxygen, not to gobble it all up himself. He's just supposed to carry the oxygen and then deliver it to target cells. We don't want him to take the oxygen up and then use it to make ATP and be a really efficient, full of ATP guy. We want him to just carry the oxygen and then drop it off at the target cells. So this lack of mitochondria ensures that red blood cell is not going to use up the oxygen that it carries. It can't. So it just makes it ATP anaerobically, doesn't need very much ATP anyways, that's enough, it's fine. And all the oxygen that it absorbs will get delivered to the target cell. Good? Good. Okay, let's get to part 2. I wasn't back for 2 minutes. This one's a little more in depth. You just gotta keep uploading. Continue on with red blood cells. We said that about 1/3 of the red blood cell's weight, and really all, or like 98% of its solid weight, solid stuff that it has, is hemoglobin. Right? So hemoglobin is super important to the red blood cells. Why? Because it's hemoglobin that transports the respiratory gases. Right? What are the respiratory gases? Oxygen and CO2. Right? We bring oxygen to our cells, we take CO2 away from our cells. And it's actually the hemoglobin that's doing that. Each of our red blood cells has over 280 million hemoglobin. Okay, that's a lot. 280 million. Each hemoglobin can bind up to 4 oxygen. So that means one red blood cell can transport like over 1 billion oxygen molecules. That's a lot. That's a whole lot. The hemoglobin can also bind for carbon dioxide. Again, they bind at different sites, and their binding, like the binding of oxygen affects the binding of carbon dioxide. They affect each other's binding. We'll talk about that more in respiratory though. So we said that hemoglobin is a protein, and we know that proteins are these really big molecules. They're chains of amino acids. Remember when we talked about protein structure last semester, we kind of looked at proteins and we broke it down into primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure, and quaternary structure. Which one was the most complex? Quaternary, right? Remember primary was just like this chain of amino acids, just the linear chain. And then we started to twist it. And then that spiral or pleat got twisted up into a unique shape. Then we threw a bunch of those substructures together, and that gave us this complex quaternary structure. So we'll take a second to look at the complex quaternary structure of hemoglobin, because it does relate to its function a little bit. We see that it's made up of 4 subunits. So 4 tertiary structures come together to make this hemoglobin molecule. So we'll have like 1, 2, 3, 4. Got like 2 alpha and 2 beta units. I need to research this more, but in children it's 2 alpha and 2 gamma units, and the gamma units convert to beta units as you age. I can't give you any information on why. I'll research that. But we've got 4 protein subunits. Each of these subunits has a molecule of something called heme. Each heme has a central atom that's iron. Okay, so there's an iron, Fe+2, in the center of each heme molecule. Okay, so that's hemoglobin. You have hundreds of millions of hemoglobin in each red blood cell. Now, the iron in the middle here is the part that carries the oxygen. Okay, iron easily associates and dissociates with oxygen. So when oxygen is present, we call it oxyhemoglobin. So oxygen plus hemoglobin. When there's no oxygen, we call it deoxyhemoglobin. But the iron here is where the oxygen is binding. And that makes sense. What charge does oxygen have?
-2.
What charge does iron have?
+2.
Okay. Only one of the oxygen in the molecule actually binds to iron. The other one like sticks off in this weird shape. But just, I won't quiz you on that, but just FYI for you chemistry people. So it's the iron that actually associates with the oxygen and carries the oxygen through the bloodstream. Okay? When we look at the carbon dioxide is actually binding to the protein subunits. It's at a completely different site. It's not binding to the iron in the center of the heme. It's binding into like a little pocket that's present in the protein subunits. Interestingly enough, if you've heard of sickle cell, right? So sickle cell anemia is the most common sickle cell disorder. But what sickle cell anemia is it's a hereditary disease. It's carried on chromosome 11. When there's a problem with the DNA on chromosome 11 is what codes for hemoglobin. So when you have a problem with chromosome 11, your recipe for how to make hemoglobin is wrong. So when you make hemoglobin, you don't make it right. You put the wrong amino acids in the wrong order, and your hemoglobin does not function appropriately. And there's different like categories or different stages of this. But what happens is during a sickle cell crisis, we'll actually see the red blood cells, instead of being this nice round discs, because of the change in that structure of the hemoglobin, they form this little like sickle shape like that. And they don't work well that way. They get clogged up in the blood vessels. They don't transport oxygen as well. It results in a lot of pain. And I mean, there's a lot that goes along with sickle cell anemia. But that's what sickle cell anemia is. Chromosome 11 is messed up, so you don't make hemoglobin appropriately. What else is important physiologically? So this site here, iron, where oxygen binds. Can anybody else tell me another gas that likes to bind to that spot? I don't know if you guys would notice or not. Think about poisoning with gas. Somebody just said it. Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide poisoning, right? Like if you run your car in the garage, like people commit suicide that way, or in houses. It doesn't really happen here, but up north it happens more. If there's a gas leak in the house, people die, right, from carbon monoxide poisoning. The reason for that is that carbon monoxide, remember, if I write it down, you write it down. Carbon monoxide binds competitively to that oxygen. What I mean by competitively is that it competes. Oxygen likes to bind there. Carbon monoxide says, no, I'm gonna bind there instead, and it kicks the oxygen off. And iron has a much higher affinity for carbon monoxide, so it likes it more. So if there's carbon monoxide in the air, you're gonna carry carbon monoxide instead of oxygen. So you stop delivering oxygen to your tissues, and that's why people end up dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. All right, so here we see our coronary structure for hemoglobin. Let's just kind of catch our balance right now. We're talking about the blood, right? Blood can be divided into what two big things? Good. I love it when you read my mind. Like I can ask these bland questions and you know exactly what this and this means. Plasma and formed elements, right? What are the three formed elements? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. We're concentrating on the red blood cells right now. What's the technical term for a red blood cell? An erythrocyte. This is an erythrocyte. Its shape's important, right? What's it shaped like? Excellent. A biconcave disc. That allows it to stack, to flex, to bend. Super important. When we look at this erythrocyte, what's the most common molecule we see in it? Hemoglobin, right? This is hemoglobin. What kind of structure is this? Lipid, carb, protein. Good. So hemoglobin is a protein. This is the hemoglobin that we're looking at. Hemoglobin has 4 subunits. You see the alpha and beta chains, 2 alpha, 2 beta. Okay, so this is a subunit, this is one, this is one, and this is one. Each subunit has a heme in the center. Each heme has iron as its central atom. Okay, that is heme. So each of these little like orange circles that you're seeing here actually is represented by this. So that's all of the atoms that are there, right? So this is pretty complex. And these little lines, remember, are like hundreds of amino acids. So this is big, big, complex molecules. But this is heme, and in the center of heme, we have iron. Where does the oxygen bind?
To the iron.
To the iron. So how many oxygen molecules could this carry? 4, right? 4 subunits, 4 heme, 4 iron, 4 oxygen. The CO2 binds to the protein subunits. Okay, the CO2 doesn't bind to the heme or the iron or anything. But again, there's 4 subunits, so 4 carbon dioxide. So we said that the function of the red blood cell is to transport the respiratory gases, right? Oxygen and CO2. It carries them through the bloodstream. We'll just take a quick second to just get our bearings and overview where the oxygen is going and where the CO2 is going and why this is happening. We'll really cover that in a lot of detail in respiratory. Okay, we'll talk about the physics behind it and the chemistry behind it and every detail in the world when we do respiratory. But for right now, let's just talk in general. So the respiratory gases are oxygen and CO2. Why do we have oxygen and get rid of CO2? Generally, like what's the whole point behind that? Beautiful, ATP, right? When we make ATP efficiently, aerobically, in the mitochondria, we use oxygen and we produce CO2 as a waste. So we need to take oxygen in order to make the ATP, and we need to get rid of that CO2 because it's a waste and our cells are making it, so it's building up in the blood and we need to get it out of us somehow. Okay, so that's why we breathe, to make ATP. So what we see happening is that in the lungs, our red blood cells will release carbon dioxide, which we said is a waste, and we want to exhale it. Right? So the red blood cells are going through the vessels, they go to the vessels in the lungs, and then they release that CO2. The CO2 crosses into the air, and we blow it out of us, because it's a waste and we want to get rid of it. We inhale, and when we inhale, we take in a bunch of oxygen. Right? So the oxygen is going to be picked up by that red blood cell. Okay, so the red blood cell releases CO2 and binds oxygen. That oxygen we want to deliver to our cells. Right, so the red blood cell goes through the vessels in the body, it goes out to the periphery, and then it's going to release the oxygen. Right, so in the periphery, the red blood cell releases oxygen to deliver to the cells. And then it picks up the carbon dioxide and takes it back to the lungs so that we can exhale it. Right? Because your cells, like here's your cell. Your cell's making ATP, so it's making CO2 as a waste, right? And it's releasing it out into this interstitial fluid. And I've got my blood over here. So the CO2 is released and then it's hanging out over here. Remember, we took oxygen in, and this oxygenated blood is coming, and I've got all this oxygen, and I deliver that to my cells, right? So the oxygen leaves the blood, the interstitial fluid, and then into my cell. All this wasted CO2 is out here hanging out, so it then enters the blood, and that CO2 gets carried back to the lungs, right? We exhale it, we inhale more oxygen, it gets delivered. We pick up the CO2 waste, bring it back to our lungs, and exhale it out of the body. Okay, is that okay, just really generally speaking?